The first topic in this series of discussions of um, significant elements of Druid ideology, and by that I mean the ideology of the ancient Druids, not Druids of the revival period of the 17th, 18th, 19th century, I'm calling will and word. I think those are two important concepts, not only for the ancients, but I think particularly for 20th and 21st century pagans as well. And so I'm going to start by talking um, about the idea of will, and another way to look at it would be intention, um, and what manifests out of intention, out of willpower, yet another word you can consider. And from that move into concepts, both Druidic and contemporary Druidic, of the word, the importance of the word as creative act, the word as magical act, and then, in a certain sense, kind of come around backwards to the finding of the word. I'll finish up by talking about concepts of inspiration, how the ancient Celts looked at inspiration, some of the images that they associated with bardic inspiration, and that will lead us into, ultimately, the guided visualization that'll finish up this evening. So the first thing I want to talk about is will. I find it sort of useful to look at concepts that acting students are exposed to in thinking about the will. Because when I use the word will, I'm usually considering it to imply intent or intention, that it's an active process in the consciousness, in the psyche, that one wills something in the sense that one wishes it to be. It's not simply an idle fancy, that if one exerts a force of will, it is with the idea that something will change as a result. And so there is an intention. And that's one of those concepts that acting students have thrown at them sort of in class number one. If you've heard of the method, so-called method acting, that's usually traced back to one way or another, the acting teacher Stanislavski in the 19th century in Russia. One of the first things that people are taught is that in looking at what it is that your character is doing in a script, you want to decide on what the character's intent is. What do they want to accomplish? And so the acting student is taught to look for things like goals, motivations. Those words get bandied around a lot. In rehearsing their dialogue, often a director may call attention to the subtext. In other words, what are they trying to indicate about their intentions by not just the words they use, but the tone of voice, the gestures that accompany them, and so on and so forth. And so starting from that basis, what is my character's intention, the young acting student is told. You then start to focus on the actions that you're using to try to achieve those goals, to manifest the intention, if you will, or more broadly in the context I'm using here, to manifest the will. What is it that as you observe the character's actions on the paper, they are doing, how are they going about trying to manifest their will? And that leads us into tactics, things that are undertaken, actions that are undertaken to, in fact, manifest the will, manifest the character's intention. And then the actor, and by extension, the character in the scene, in the moment, is looking at the results that come about. And then that, in turn, modifies the will and leads into another action. So you have a cycle of a feedback loop, if you will, of action, a reaction, and then a new intention that develops into a new action, and so on and so forth. Now, I've couched all of that in terms of what a young acting student would learn, but all of that is really just from reflection on life and the way people go through life psychologically, the way all of us undertake to get through our daily lives. I'm going through this process right now. I've approached this evening's talk by deciding what concepts were most important in my mind to communicate to the hypothetical students who would be showing up, what tactics I can employ to most clearly communicate them. So I do things like outlining the major points I want to cover, deciding on what order to lay things out and to maybe try to find a creative architecture for the whole talk, and so on and so forth. But then, as I start to try to pursue that intention, try to communicate the points that I want to lay out for everybody, I'm also at the same time paying attention to what's actually coming about in the real world. Is everybody nodding off? Is everybody nodding agreement? All of that feeds back into either reinforcing or modifying my intention. But lurking behind all of that, there is a sense of will that maybe is even broader than that. What is it that brought me to this place to teach? And what is the sort of force, the passion that keeps me pursuing the intention, that would make me want to come back and teach again next week, that having taught before makes me want to teach again, and so on. All of these are aspects of personal will, of a dynamic drive to move forward in life and to have an impact on your circumstances. Ritual activity, I would submit, and religious activity more generally, including things like prayer and offerings, personal offerings, things like that, are expressions of will. They are attempts to have a favorable effect on one's circumstances. I suppose it could be argued that at times in life, probably unbeknownst to ourselves, we're acting perversely and that we're exercising a force of will that is pursuing something that's negative for us. But I think at least consciously, most of the time, if not all the time, human beings go through life wanting to have a positive impact on their circumstances. And so as a result, that basic core drive is pursued by various tactics, the setting of various goals, the monitoring of the results, the real-world impacts, the actual changes in the circumstances that result. And there we're into that same sort of loop, that endless cycle of action and reaction and reconsideration that I described as part of actor training. It is, of course, part of everyday life. But let's focus just on the notion of intent. Let's say we're going to hold a ritual. And even more specifically, let's say within that ritual, for whatever reason, there's going to be a group prayer to bring rain because there's been a drought. Let's just use that as just a hypothetical. It seems to me that there are two important components to expressing that intention and pursuing that intention in the context of a prayer in the midst of, say, a ritual. The first is to mean everything you say, and the second is to say everything that you mean. And I think both concepts are important, maybe equally so, and often not considered fully enough. What do I mean when I say those things? What do I mean when I say, first of all, meaning everything that you say? You have to be committed to the intention. That if one undertakes to do anything in life, I would submit, one has to be fully engaged in it. All too often we aren't. All too often we go through life as a series of rote repetitions, empty rituals, if you will, rather than rituals that are charged with intent and with meaning. And by ritual, I mean the ritual of feeding the cat or washing the dishes as much as I do, say, a big druidic ritual with 20, 30, 40 people attending it. It's all too easy to, if you will, fall into autopilot. and undertake actions, say things that aren't really fully invested with intent, that aren't really fully considered, to speak glibly, quickly, without prior consideration and full engagement. So the first thing to do in order to mean everything that you say is to be very clear about your intent. And I would submit that in the context of a ritual, both from the standpoint of, say, viewing the ritual as a shared occasion, which hopefully will be meaningful to many participants, but also as an occasion where, however one conceives of this, the participants are standing before and communing with higher powers, gods and goddesses, spirits, however one conceives of these powers. It's important to be as clear, as specific, and therefore as committed to your intention as possible. So, to get back to the hypothetical situation, one is stepping forward to lead people in some sort of prayer, maybe accompanied with some sort of offering, in order to try to influence the universe to bring some rain. Do you really want the rain? Do you know that if you're offering to, say, a specific god or a specific goddess, that, first of all, this is the appropriate target for your prayer, that this is really who you want to be talking to? But more importantly, and I think more relevance, have you really stopped to consider who or what this being, this entity that you're addressing is? How do you feel about them? How do you visualize them, him or her, if at all? Are you speaking to what is really ultimately for you a concept, a psychological, interior concept? Are you speaking to a being that you fully believe to be and consider to be an external presence, some sort of transcendent being, something outside yourself? None of these things are, right or wrong. They're different. They can be highly personal. But the important thing is to be, and this is a big word for me personally, authentic about who it is you're addressing and what it is you hope to accomplish. When you say or do something, particularly in a ritual setting, speak with authenticity. Be engaged fully in what it is you're doing, what it is you're saying, believe in it, want it to be true if you're asking for something to come to pass, and have an authentic concept, not someone else's concept, but your own felt and or believed concept of who it is or what it is that you're addressing. Everything that comes out of your mouth in these actions, all the gestures that support them, whether they're simply hand gestures with nods of head or an actual, say, offering of incense or something into a ritual fire or into a well, that sort of thing, should be meaningful. It should mean something to you, and that meaning should flow out of you in what you say. It should inform spontaneously your tone of voice, the energy behind your gestures, all of it. And the way to do that, the way to get at that authenticity, is to take the time to be clear about what it is you intend to do. Make sure you've thought it through, is the simplest way to put it. But the other half of this is saying everything you mean. If you're clear about what it is you want, we want enough rain to put an end to this drought. Well, is that really what you want? And how much do you have to say that fully? Have you looked into it enough to know how much rain would actually end a drought? I'm going to ask for that. As opposed to, we need a lot of rain. Boy, the land is dry. We want a lot of rain. Now, I have my own ambivalences about how magic works on the material plane, and I'm actually going to come back to that topic. But assuming for the moment that action, if one were to work magic in that way in a ritual setting, assuming that does have an impact in the material world, just saying we want a lot of rain, well, you could find yourselves with mudslides and houses washed away and so on. You want to actually ask for what it is you really want, and not, again, a sort of halfway finished, half-baked invocation, prayer, chant, hymn, what have you. express it fully. Even if that means adding more words, even if you run the risk of being verbose. If you look at what survives to us of ancient prayers and charms and incantations from people who did write their pre-Christian pagan ritual works down, like the Vedic peoples of India, like the Greeks and the Romans, some of their prayers are very, very lengthy. Some of the epithets and honors that are paid to deities being addressed can go on for a few lines of verse in a prayer. Maybe that's larding it a bit heavily, but then again, maybe not. Maybe that's reflective of just how much importance the ancients put on this sort of work, on the verbalizing of intent, of communing with and connecting verbally with, accompanied often by physical offerings, connecting with the gods and goddesses and other spirits. So be clear first with yourself about what it is you really want, and then be sure that in the doing, you express that fully. Knowing what you want fully, meaning what you say, isn't entirely helpful if you keep half of it inside, if you don't actually express it, if you interiorize it too much and don't make it real. Which brings me to the next part of this, which is to get into the notion of the word a little bit. For the Indo-European peoples, which includes the Celts, it seems to me that the uttering of the word, the crafting of the word, the bringing into being of the word was the quintessential religious action. It certainly was the quintessential magical action. And I think that's true of more recent magical traditions and occult traditions. I think many modern pagans, be they Druids, Wiccans, or what have you, probably have some sense of that, that for all the importance of things like singing and dancing and drumming, that ultimately the architecture on which those sort of emotionally charged activities hang is still going to be the words that are spoken, the sentences that are strung together. Communication is still least ambiguous, most potent when it's done by language that's shared by multiple participants. In terms of changing things, in terms of bringing about a change in circumstances, to get back to what I started saying a few minutes ago, we may not be sure that we can actually change the world when we speak things. We may not really be sure what kind of impact we have when we do anything. So before we set about to focus on changing the world, one thing that we can be sure we do when we exercise our will and when we bring our will, first of all, into real being by speaking, by uttering a word, is we change the self. I personally believe very strongly, and I think this is an article of faith for a lot of occult and magical traditions as well as other forms of modern spiritual practice, that the quintessential work of magic is the changing of the self, and that as you change the self, you become more adept at changing the world around you. And one thing that changes you is what you say, not what you think, not what you hold inside. This gets back to what I said a moment ago about saying everything that you mean. What you put out into the world, even if you're alone and you say it, and I suspect a lot of people have this experience, that it's different to actually say something out loud than to just think it inside, even if you're the only person who hears it. Because it's one of the things that happens when you speak something aloud is you're forced to clarify. You're forced to put it into one form rather than another. In the inside of our heads, we can maintain an awful lot of ambiguity. We can be very slippery inside. But once we actually have to say something, we've chosen to put it in one form rather than another form. And it can't be sucked back in. Once something has been said, once it's been put out into the universe, it may reverberate away. No one may ever say that exact combination of words ever again, but it has been said and it can't be unsaid. And I think that gets at the essential power of the word. as the manifestation of the interior will. There's a book that I would recommend to people who are interested in sort of reading a little more deeply into this called The Artful Universe by a fellow named Mahony, Mahony. He writes specifically about the Vedic traditions of ancient India, the pre-Hindu traditions of India. But what he writes is very applicable to other Indo-European cultures, and I would say very much applicable to what we can reconstruct of the ancient religions of the Druids. And the title of the book, which I'm going to come back to again a little bit, is The Artful Universe. And that's at the core of what I'm talking about, that there is an essential creativity to the world, that the world itself sets a sort of paradigm for us as human beings by being constantly changing, constantly bringing things into being, and that we as human beings can, in a certain sense, emulate that. That priesthoods and poets have been, at least in the Indo-European traditions, charged in a sense with doing that, with emulating the constant creative, ongoing creative act of the universe, the cosmos, through their work, through the creation of sacred poetry, of hymns and chants, of the performance of ritual that is in itself the kind of founding of its own sacred world, its own little miniature cosmos, if you will. And Mahony in The Artful Universe examines that a little bit. And I'll come back to that larger concept, the universe itself as a creative, having a creative thread to it in a little bit here. But that, again, is just to sort of underscore my sense that for the ancients, particularly the ancient Indo-Europeans, including the Celts, the societies in which the Druids operated, this idea of the creativity that's inherent in the crafting of and the uttering of the word, and the creating of poetry, and the speaking of prayers, in the chanting of chants and hymns, that's the most important, quintessential religious action. Can we change the world, though, other than just sort of change our place in it, our part in it, have sort of a token impact by having said something aloud even to ourselves? Can we, in fact, change the world? And I would say that anytime we come into community, which can just be two people, or it can just be, the self and any other animate being that one feels that you're in communication with, the action of putting out the word, of saying things, of crafting utterances and putting them out, cannot but change the experience of the one or more other beings that one is in community with, that one is connecting with, that one is communicating with. And that's a good word, communicate, because it does have within it community, that same root. And the way in which one leaves a footprint, if you will, by what one says and does, I like to think of as one's works. That as one goes through the day, day after day after day, year after year after year, one carries a force of will, an ongoing moment-to-moment set of intentions that one manifests in different ways by expressing oneself, by putting that will out energetically, verbally, and so forth into the world. And in essence, then, as one passes along one's journey, day by day, year by year, one does leave, again, to use this image, footprints behind. One has changed things. One has shifted the dynamic of one's circumstances, of the community and the cosmos. And those are, in a sense, the works one leaves. What's the line? I think it's from Keats. I can't remember the name of the poem, but look upon my works, ye mighty, in despair, writes Keats. And the context is of a fallen statue half buried in the desert that once upon a time some great potentate had erected and assumed it would last forever, and that some other mighty person would come by and be awed by just how mighty this previous rulers' works were. So that I love that word though, works, in the sense of something that lives on after oneself. And one can have too grandiose a notion of one's impact. One can have too inflated an opinion or estimation of of the value and the impact of one's works. And so I sort of like to think of it as, most of the time in life we're sort of, if you think about the scale of the earth, let alone of the universe as a whole, we're leaving, at best, sort of the kind of footprints that you might leave on a tile floor after you got out of the shower that sort of, evaporate away after a little bit. But you've left something behind you. You've walked on, and at least for a moment, there's some residue of your passage. Sometimes we leave huge scars or mars. We take a hammer to the tile and leave a chip. We do something malicious or ill-considered. We lash out, we strike out with our will. We don't do what we really mean, or we don't do everything that we should have done. Don't say everything we should have said. In all of these ways, we leave behind us some residue of ourselves and some residue of our actions, some residue of our words. And so this cycles back around to the notion of being clear about intent, of taking the time in life to stop and reflect, to think before you speak, to put just as simply as that. But that's not a trivial conceit. That if one starts from this premise, as the ancients did, that what one says has tremendous power. And that's a concept I'll come back to in a little bit as well. But speaking of power, just sort of parenthetically, the ancient Irish had notions of the force of things and the force of people, the kind of, to use a big word, efficacy, the ability, capability of not just people, but also things in the natural world, to exert influence or have an impact on their surroundings, around their circumstances. And they distinguished between two different kinds of such power, of such efficacy. They had two words, bri, B-R-I, and bua, B-U-A. And I'm indebted here a little bit to the pagan writer Ian Corrigan, who's developed this concept pretty fully in a couple of privately published books, which I really like. Bri, B-R-I, is regarded as the inherent power that something has from its creation, or in the case of a being like a human being, from its birth, that for whatever reason, just as many people feel that they sense lines of power in the earth or vortexes in places like Sedona, Arizona, that there are powerful spots on the earth, so too perhaps in terms of personal charisma. I mean, we don't always understand why some people are more attractive or regarded as more charismatic than others. But it seems in life that there are certain objects and certain people and certain places that have an inherent magnetism to them or an inherent sort of influence to them. And on some levels, I'll be coming back to this in a subsequent talk when I talk about sacred places and also working with a sacred landscape. So there is this notion that everybody has at least some store of power within, this concept of bri, to use the Irish term. But the good news is, at least if you subscribe to this Irish conception of things, your ability to sort of manifest and pursue your will isn't limited to this inherent store of power or energy or force. It's not limited to your bri. But you also can build up energy, which they would have called bua, B-U-A, which is loosely an earned power, energy, magnetism, ability to influence. And probably a fairly familiar way to look at this is from the standpoint of considering, say, a magical tool. For a Wiccan, say, who has an athame, right, a sacred dagger that's usually regarded as an instrument of will, where the blade can be used in a sense to direct the will, or the stereotypical magician's wand. I think a lot of modern pagans are familiar with the notion that you might want to charge your magical tools, that you do things, whether it's through prayer or treating them with essential oils that have appropriate correspondences, etc., that you want to try to build up some sort of potency in the magical tool. And from this Irish conception, what you're doing when you do that is you're building up a store of this quality called bua, this earned energy, this earned forcefulness. And that human beings can do that too, that one can build up a store of efficacy, of capableness. Now, how would one do that? I think there's probably a lot of ways you could, if you're inclined to do so, you could do this presumably through things like meditation. You could do it through the working of spell work, occult practices, and there's all sorts of traditional approaches, Celtic and non-Celtic. But I think, again, one of the simplest is in the same way that you might want to, if you're familiar with electronics at all, charge up a capacitor, build up a charge in a capacitor, and then release it into a circuit. This notion I've already laid out of considering what one's intent is, of being careful to decide what one's objective is before undertaking an action, it seems to me is very analogous to that, of building up sort of potential energy before you release it. That's a pretty simple, commonplace thing. There's nothing particularly magical about it, but I think it harmonizes with this whole conception of starting out with your own inherent store of brie, and then undertaking whatever actions you can to build up the bua, to build up this sort of earned potential energy that can be used to achieve your goals. You can conceive of that, from a kind of traditionally magical standpoint, or you, like me, who doesn't do much magical work, you can just look at it from the commonplace, everyday, ordinary, sensible position of what can I do to prepare myself before I undertake an action? How much should I look before I leap, to use an old cliche? Next topic I want to touch on. That's the end of the section on will. This would be the beginning of a section on another big word, which is truth. And I'd write it with a capital T, because truth, particularly for the Celts, and we know this to be very true from Irish manuscript evidence, truth is a central concept for the ancient, not just pre-Christian, but Christian-era peoples of Ireland and other Celtic lands. I'm going to talk about a couple different approaches to truth. One of them will be the truth of the poet. Another is going to be the truth of the king. They're not unrelated, although I'll talk about them separately. But just for a moment, I want to be clear about what I mean when I say truth. Truth, it seems to me, is not fact. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. At least I know I do, and I think a lot of people in Western European, North American society do that as well. We live in a society that is very much influenced by some of the Greek thinkers, particularly Aristotle, who were very prone to want to categorize and classify, put things in little boxes, to see the world as something that can be measured, interpreted, analyzed, judged, and categorized. And subsequent developments in Western philosophy have tended in subtle and not so subtle ways to emphasize that. So as a consequence, I think we're sort of socialized and educated to think that when somebody says something is true, to think of it only in one possible meaning, or mostly in one possible meaning, which is that a thing is true because it can be observed, it can be verified objectively in the material world. And that even has, I think, some sneaky bleed over into some of the mainstream religious traditions. I think if people really stopped to think about it and were really careful about what they meant when they said it, if they talk about, say, the Judeo-Christian Bible as being true or literally true, they might equivocate. They might not be, quite categorical in saying it means everything that happened in the Bible actually did happen in the material world, although many people do believe that. But I think that there's a tendency to just sort of gloss over that and just sort of say as a blanket statement that, Scripture is true, and that you just sort of assume that that means true in the sense of verifiable, happened in this world, not in some other world, could have been measured, could have been observed. If there were cameras, then it could have been photographed, without really adopting a particularly critical attitude towards that. Just because that's kind of how we're accustomed to, as Westerners, using the word truth. We use it to refer to factual, verifiable in the material world. That's not really the best, fullest, most useful sense of the word truth, and it certainly isn't the sense in which it would have been used by the ancients, at least not the ancient Celts. The word in Irish is fiorina. That's the original sort of Gaelic word that we would be using if I weren't translating everything into English here, all these concepts into English. And fiorina had an important place in understanding the relationship of human beings to the cosmos and the effect of human beings on the physical universe and on each other. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about poetic truth. And when I say that, I really literally mean the role of the poet, the ancient poet, in, say, traditional Celtic society, in preserving and embodying truth. As I've said already, when something's spoken, when a word is crafted and uttered as it would be by a poet, it can't be unsaid, it can't be destroyed. It might not ever be heard again, but the action. So speaking of the king, the truth of the king is a phrase that we actually do find in the Irish literature. And much as you might be familiar with the notion of the relationship of Arthur as the wounded king to the wasteland that ensued, there is, in fact, a long-standing Celtic tradition that suggests that the king, the ruler's truthfulness, their sort of unblemished suitability physically for the role was bound up with the health and prosperity of the land. That if the king was untruthful or unfit, unsuitable, that the prosperity of the land would suffer. Now, at least just parenthetically, I think it's worth considering, and there's probably no good answer to this, but again, it's worth considering. In modern-day North America, where we live in democratic societies with no kings, who might be the analogous figure? Who would we consider to be the king who maintains a relationship of healthful balance with the land? Who is it that embodies, if you will, the entirety of the people and their suitability to receive bounty from the cosmos? And I think you can answer that in a lot of different ways. In ancient societies, a king ruled over a relatively, particularly in ancient Ireland, ruled over a fairly small amount of land, a fairly small amount of people, a few thousand. If you look at, say, the president of the United States, there's hundreds of millions. It may not be an analogous figure. It may be unfair to load up on, say, George W. Bush, the responsibility to embody the fitness of all of the hundreds of millions of people who live in the United States of America to receive the bounty of the land. So maybe we have to consider, a different kind of paradigm in the latter day for, who is the fit representative of the people. Maybe we have to look at that creatively and not quite so literally, and imagine that, say, when we're in ritual, that perhaps there's somebody who has to take on the responsibility of sort of speaking for everybody. Because that sort of thing does happen. We do have spokespeople. We do have clergy in the religious sense. I mean, there are local community official or ad hoc, who are put forward for one reason or another because they're seen as suitable. They're seen as fit to represent some sort of constituency. It was understood, as I say, though, in ancient times that that person really had to be fit. They really were meant to be whole. And in the myths, that's sort of rendered literally. They were meant to be unblemished. They were supposed to be physically undamaged. This would hold true for the king of the gods. Was supposed to be intact and unblemished. In fact, one of our sources for understanding the importance of this concept is in the myths. Nuada, the king of the Irish gods, had to step down from the throne when his hand was cut off in battle. And it was during that period that Lu, who was a newcomer to the Irish gods, temporarily assumed the throne. In terms of the relationship of the king as this fit representative to the land, in ritual, in many of the Indo-European societies, including the Irish, there was a ritual wedding the king, symbolically or perhaps even literally, to a representative of the sovereignty goddess, of the goddess of the land. We find examples of this all the way down into well into the historic era. And it's been speculated that one reason that it may have been critically important for there to be a poet who had almost as much status, if not as much status, as the king or other noblemen in Celtic society, to have a court poet, if you will, with that much status, was that the poet was, in a certain sense, wedded to the nobleman in the same way that the nobleman was seen spiritually as wedded to the goddess in the land. That the poet was a sort of human representative for a stand-in, if you will, for the sovereignty figure. There's traditions, not just in Celtic poetry, but even, I suppose, in English poetry and probably others as well, that's almost homoerotic in the way the poet describes the male patron, usually male patron. And it doesn't necessarily mean that there was, in fact, some sort of homosexual relationship. It may have to do with a sense in which, on some level or another, it was understood that this was a relationship that was akin to being wedded to each other. And it has been speculated, as I said, that the sense may have been that the poet stood in for sovereignty to whom the nobleman was wedded. I want to return just for a moment to that notion of the artful universe, again, to take Mahoney's book title out of context for a second. If the ruler and the poet both were meant to embody a kind of balance, wholeness, rightness, appropriateness that we can loosely call truth, so too, as I said, the universe has its own kind of activity, its own creativeness. And there is, in a certain sense, in the ancient Indo-European conception of things, a justness, a balance, a rightness to that creative current in the universe. Different cultures called it by different words. We don't really have a good Celtic, Irish, or Welsh word for it. But the pre-Hindu Indians called it Preta. There's a similar Germanic concept, weird, which referred to a kind of web of fate. In a more literal sense, the Greeks used moira as a word to refer to fate, which was a kind of implacable current that even the highest of the gods, Zeus, was subject to, that you could not step outside and could not control. There was, in a sense, to use a phrase, and I could attribute it to a modern druid from Pittsburgh named Eric Canale, a great way of things. You could equate that to the Tao in Taoist thought, that there is a kind of an unknowable, transcendent current of things, and that when the poet and the king are acting in harmonious, truthful ways, at least in my interpretation of things, they are acting in harmony with that great way of things, with that current of creativeness, that current of balance and truth and order, kind of cosmic orderliness. It's kind of ongoing current of creativity that's resident in the cosmos, and that we try to not get drown in. We try to flow along with it. We try to sort of go with the flow, if you will, on that level. Last topic I want to touch on is inspiration, and just throw out some ancient Celtic conceptions of that that you might consider and might want to play with. If the poet is trying to touch this current of truth, this artful current in the universe, the way to do it is to somehow let the universe and that higher level of creativity somehow come into him or her, and to inspire them. Now, if you consider the word inspiration for a second and break that word down a bit, there's that root spir, S-P-I-R, which of course relates to spirit, which we relate to the life force. It quite literally relates to the breath, to respire, as an artificial respiration. And again, that prefix in speaks to animation, to a life force, to a vital force coming in. And so one is, in a certain sense, taking in vitality, taking in creativeness, when one finds inspiration, seeks inspiration, embodies inspiration, acts with inspiration. One phrase that comes out of an ancient Irish poem that is very popular as a sort of summing up of Celtic conceptions of inspiration, poetic inspiration specifically, is the fire in the head. That's a translation of part of a line from the so-called Song of Aurigin, who was in the myths the first human bard in the island of Ireland, kind of a magical druidic bard figure. So that phrase in his poem is hard to translate, but it's usually rendered as something like fire in the head, and that's taken to mean poetic inspiration. Why? Because most of the conceptions of the receiving of or achieving of genuine inspiration have to do with heat, have to do often with cauldrons, something I'll come back to in a second. More generally, there's an ancient root word, gor, G-O-R, that's a sort of a Proto-Indo-European root. It has to do with a particular kind of heat, the heat of gestation or incubation, the heat of the womb. And there's a relationship between that concept and poetic creation, poetic inspiration, that one incubates one's creations, one gestates and then gives birth to its creations. There is a tract whose title, an Irish tract whose title usually translated, or at least often translated, as the Cauldron of Poesy, that relates to this. Bridget, goddess Bríd, to use the Irish, is, among other things, a goddess of poetry, a matron of poets. Her associations are with the hearth, they're with fire, also with the forge. She's a matron of smiths as well as poets. And so again, that reinforces this notion of the fieriness, the energy of inspiration, seeking the fire in the head. Specifically, there are images of a cauldron, often a boiling cauldron, or a cook fire, that relates to the achieving of inspiration. That chewing of meat, cooked or raw, depends on the context, has to do with achieving some sort of insight or inspiration. But in particular, there's this image of a cauldron from which some sort of source of inspiration springs. We find this sort of cooked stuff that brings inspiration both in the Welsh story of Taliesin, who inadvertently drinks of a cauldron that provides magical inspiration for him, powers of shape-shifting and so forth. And also the Irish hero in Finn McCool, eating of the salmon of wisdom that's been cooked. Again, there's images of this sort of cooking, stewing, that inspiration isn't just sort of found lying around, that it's something that takes effort, it takes heat. Um, it has to be created before it can be wielded. And it also, this is another image, it also flows. One of the grades that one progressed through as one trained to be a master poet, the name translates as noble stream. I think that's an excellent image, that that the poet sort of pours forth poetry. And of course, the water could be poured out of the cauldron, think of it that way. So you could almost envision the boiling depths of a cauldron that's ready to simply overflow with this churning water that represents and embodies poetic inspiration. And just to throw it out there because it exists, and you find it in contemporary Druid usage, there's the notion of the three rays of Awen. Awen, A-W-E-N, being a Welsh term that has to do with poetic inspiration. And there is a notion that, and this relates to the myth of Taliesin, I believe, that there is a descent of Awen, a descent of inspiration into the individual, into the bard. And one reason I bring this image up is because it involves three rays. And that number, 3, is an important magical number, a sacred number for the Indo-European cultures, including the Celts. So it's significant, certainly not unexpected, that something like that, you wouldn't have 2 rays or 7 rays. You more than likely than anything else have 3. So all of these things, the heat within the water is an important image. The activity, the flowing of waters, drops flying out of a boiling cauldron, movement of water is important as an image for inspiration. But above all, there's the notion of gestation, of going into the womb and incubating. And the way the poets were trained down into very recent times in Ireland and Scotland was through what some people describe as a form of sensory deprivation. They would go into cells, into small darkened chambers, and lie, perhaps with their heads covered with a tartan fabric or something like that, with their plaid cloak. And having taken in the land, having seen the glories of the cosmos around them, they would then go into this dark chamber and shut out the light, shut out everything but, if you will, the fire in their head, and begin to compose without pen or paper, alone in the dark, incubating in this sort of confined environment until they were released out into the light again and were expected to be able to recite inspired works of poetry. That's the material I wanted to cover tonight. I'm going to take just a couple minutes break, and then I want to lead you guys on a little bit of a visualization. For the guided visualization that follows, you should have a lit candle before you. You may wish to pause the recording at this time in order to set up and light a candle for that purpose. Find a comfortable seated position facing the candle. You are supported. Floor beneath you, the earth beneath the floor upholds you. And resting comfortably in the arms of the earth, you breathe. Before you, the warm, inviting glow of the candle's flame. Close your eyes and hold in your vision eye that bright light of the candle flame before you as you breathe. Your breath drawing energy from the candle's glow there in your vision eye your inner sight. The light of the candle expands, and it becomes the sun over a green field. Before you, a path through the field. You move along the path, surrounded by green, warmed by the sun, the sounds of animals and birds in and above the greenery on all sides. An animal, a cow, you pass. A bird above, a hawk, circling you, sunwise above. As you continue along the path, ahead of you is a bank of trees, dark yet inviting. The path leads into the trees, into this small forest, the edge of the field. You enter, continue along the path, hearing, feeling, tasting, sensing the different sounds and sensations of animals, birds within the forest. In the underbrush, something moves. A boar. You continue along. Another beast moves. Just at the edge of sight, a stag. Ahead, in the depths of the trees, a glow of light. You approach, it resolves itself into a fire, and above the fire a cauldron, simmering as you approach. Approach the cauldron, look into its depths. Perhaps you taste of it, perhaps the heat deters you. As you look around to see what is lit by the light of the cooking fire, a small domed stone hut with one entrance, one low door, a beehive of gray stone. The light from the cook fire fails to penetrate the darkness inside this small chamber. Move into the chamber through the one entrance into the dark interior. You lay down. What is beneath you? The earth? Grass? Cloth? You shut your eyes in the darkness of this enclosed cell, secure. Perhaps to be doubly secure, you cover your face, your eyes, your head, the cloth, the cloak, blanket. And there you lie, full of all the sights, the sounds, the smells that you carried with you from the field, from the forest, from the fire. And you explore this inner world. You move through the inner world. You find yourself moving back into the realm in which you find yourself lying in the darkened chamber. As you bring back from that inner world all that you've found, you make your way back out, retrace your steps in your own time, when you are ready. Past the cauldron, past the trees, past the field, into the sun, drawn back to the candle's flame.